Hey guys, tonight we begin with the world of the American Wild West, that glorious stretch of 19th century chaos where personal hygiene was optional, and so was the law. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to the Wild West, where the weather is hot, the dust is permanent, and your wardrobe is the difference between being mistaken for a hardened local or a fresh-baked idiot from back east. Let's start with the basics. Clean is a liability. If your shirt is white, pressed, and tucked in, people will assume one of two things. You're here to collect taxes, or you're about to get robbed. Possibly both. In fact, a crisp white shirt in this environment is less style statement and more rob me, I'm soft. Dress code rule number 1. Look like you've lost a fight. If your clothes aren't torn, patched, or at least stained with something questionable, you're either a lawman, a banker, or someone who hasn't been here long enough to regret it. Bonus points. If your coat smells faintly of old tobacco, gunpowder, and something no one dares identify. Colours. Stick to post-apocalyptic dirt palette. Browns, greys, and anything that could pass for weather damage. If you show up in something colourful, say a bright blue vest, you'll draw attention, envy, and possibly a bullet from a man who hates flair. Boots should be beat to hell. Shiny boots say, I just got off the train and have tender, naive ankles. Real survivors wear boots so scuffed they could pass for stone. If one has a hole in it, congratulations, and you're finally blending in. Hats? Absolutely, but choose wisely. A hat that's too tall says, I'm compensating for something. A hat that's too small makes you look like a confused child lost at a gunfight. You want weather-beaten brim, not stagecoach magician. And yes, accessories matter. A bandana around your neck is great, unless you tie it like someone who reads poetry aloud at sunset. Go for, I use this to filter horse water, not I wear this on dates. Optional, something rusty, a rusty knife, a rusty spur, a rusty flask you pretend still has whiskey in it. Rust tells people you've either survived a lot or given up entirely. Both are respected. In short, wear dust, wear grit, and wear the kind of expression that says, I've slept in a barn and liked it. Because in the Wild West, if you look important, you die first. In the Wild West, words were like bullets, best used sparingly, and ideally not aimed at someone's horse. Let's be clear, bragging will get you into trouble faster than dysentery in summer. No one cares if you were the fastest draw in Missouri, or if you once wrestled a mountain lion, which, let's be honest, was probably a house cat with an attitude. Out here, confidence is like seasoning. A little goes a long way, and if you lay it on thick, someone's going to want to test how crunchy you really are. So rule number 1, understate everything. If someone asks if you can shoot, shrug and say, a little. If they ask if you've ever been in a gunfight, say, not recently. Even if you've been in more shootouts than poker games, play it down. Bragging is a verbal invitation to get humbled, usually in public and usually face first. Now, about staring. Do not stare. Don't stare at the sheriff. Don't stare at the outlaw in the corner. Don't stare at the guy with one eye and 3 knives. The only thing you should stare at in the Wild West is your drink, and even then, only to make sure it's not moving. And then there's the horse situation. You may be tempted to compliment a man's horse. Don't. You may be tempted to pat the horse. Really don't. You may, and this happens, feel the urge to wink at a particularly majestic stallion. If you do this, prepare to be buried with your boots on. In the hierarchy of Western society, a man's horse ranks just above his mother and just below his revolver. Touching it, flirting with it, or even glancing too long at it is considered either a challenge or foreplay. Neither ends well. The safest approach? Head down, words short, and compliments limited to things that can't shoot back. Say things like, nice weather, or decent beans. Avoid saying, I'm pretty good with a gun, unless you want to demonstrate that skill immediately, while bleeding. The Wild West doesn't reward extroverts. It rewards people who can walk into a saloon, order a drink, and leave without anyone remembering their name or their face. The Wild West was dotted with towns, some booming with promise, others rotting in their own legend. And choosing the wrong one was less about inconvenience and more about whether your bones would end up as set dressing in a saloon fireplace. First rule, avoid any town that describes itself as lively. That's code for gunfights at noon and burials by supper. If the sign outside is full of bullet holes and the welcome committee is just a vulture on a post, turn around. You're looking for something quiet, not dead, just underwhelming. A place where people are too tired to cause trouble and too dusty to chase you if you do. Then again, maybe you crave opportunity. Maybe you're thinking, I'll head to a boomtown. Yes, by all means. Try your luck in some rapidly sprouting gold rush hamlet where the population doubles every week, and so does the crime rate. You'll make money if you survive long enough to remember where you buried it. Boomtowns are where fortunes are made and morals are misplaced. No one asks questions. No one remembers names. And the only thing more inflated than the prices is the body count behind the saloon. But let's say you want stability, civilization, law, safety. So you go where the railroad stops and there's a church, a schoolhouse, and maybe even a mayor. Sounds ideal, until you realize the mayor is a drunk, the sheriff's been shot twice this week, and the preacher moonlights as a poker dealer. There is no such thing as a safe town out here. There are just towns where you die slower. Before you settle down, ask a few simple questions. Does this place have more graves than houses? Do people make eye contact or reach for something when you enter the room? Is the general store selling coffins next to canned beans? If the answer to any of those is yes, keep riding. In the end, the perfect Wild West town isn't the one with riches, railroads, or romance. It's the one where no one notices you, no one asks where you're from, and, most importantly, no one assumes you're someone else they were supposed to shoot. If you thought surviving the Wild West would at least come with a good night's sleep, you might be suffering from cranial optimism, a rare condition not commonly found west of the Mississippi. In this world, sleep isn't rest, it's roulette. A necessary but deeply dangerous lapse in vigilance. Sure, your body needs to recharge, so does your horse. But unlike your horse, you don't have eyes on the side of your head or the ability to kick threats in the chest while lying down. Start with the options. You've got 3. Option 1, the saloon floor. Charming, historic, soaked in a decade's worth of spilled drinks, shattered teeth, and possibly blood. If you're lucky, you'll share space with 3 other unconscious men and 1 dog that might be dead or just sleeping off a fight. Either way, no refunds. Option 2, a cot at the local boarding house. It's cleanish, has walls, probably a ceiling, maybe even a bed frame. But don't let that fool you. Every snore in the next room is a potential knife fight waiting to happen, and good luck locking your door. Most locks are ceremonial. Option 3, the great outdoors. Nature, silence, exposure, coyotes, bandits, sudden storms, all the classic wilderness features, plus a 100% chance of waking up with something crawling on you, possibly with opinions. So what do? You sleep like a nervous raccoon, 1 eye open, 1 hand near a weapon, and never ever facing the wall. That's how you get silently robbed, or worse, hugged by a prospector. Pro tip. If you hear someone whispering your name while you're half asleep, don't answer. It's either a ghost, a hallucination, or someone about to sell you land that doesn't exist. The key is to nap aggressively and often. 10 minutes behind a barrel. 15 in the saddle while your horse pretends to know where it's going. An hour in the jail cell before the sheriff realizes you're not technically under arrest. In the Wild West, water is life. It's also disease, deception, and, on occasion, solid proof that God had a sense of humor. Let's start with the obvious. Most water out here is trying to kill you. It might look clear, might sound like a gentle brook, but make no mistake. That gurgling stream is carrying more bacteria than a barber's shared tooth pliers. You see, water sources were community hotspots, not just for thirsty cowboys, but for horses, cattle, bandits, stray dogs, and the occasional prospector who's been bathing in the same spot since the Lincoln administration. So if you're dipping your cup straight into the creek, congratulations, you just ingested the entire local ecosystem. You could try boiling it, assuming you have a fire, a pot, and 10 minutes of peace, which in the Wild West is the same as asking for a unicorn. Instead, most people just drank it and hoped their insides were too stubborn to die. Of course, if you're rich, or just exceptionally reckless, you'll opt for whiskey instead. Technically, it's not hydrating. Actually, it is dehydrating. But hey, at least it comes with a burn so aggressive you forget you were thirsty. That's frontier logic. Numb the symptoms, ignore the cause. Rainwater? Good luck. It either never shows up, or it does all at once and washes away your mule, your hat, and half your self-esteem. Catching it in a bucket is great, until you wake up to find a squirrel doing laps in it. Some towns had wells, emphasis on had. Wells dry up, collapse, or get poisoned accidentally on purpose during disputes over land, livestock, or who insulted whose stew. If someone offers you fresh well water, ask how many people drank it yesterday and how many of them are still alive. In short, water in the Wild West is not your friend. It's a beautiful liar, a treacherous companion, and possibly the last thing you taste before seeing the inside of a pine box. Let's get one thing straight. Food in the Wild West wasn't cooked for enjoyment. It was cooked to not kill you immediately, and even that was hit or miss. Your diet will consist of a few basic food groups: beans, biscuits, bacon, and lies. Beans are everywhere. Pinto, black, possibly magic. They're cooked in a pot over a fire that's older than most marriages. They come with a spoon, no seasoning, and the lingering suspicion that you've eaten this same bowl before, possibly this exact bowl. Biscuits are less food and more edible gravel. If you're lucky, they're warm. If you're not, they double as blunt weapons. Some cowboys sharpen them on rocks and throw them at coyotes. Others just soak them in coffee until they resemble sadness. Then there's bacon, the crown jewel. The salty, greasy, vaguely recognizable strip of meat that makes everything seem momentarily better, until you realize you've eaten nothing but pork and regret for 4 straight weeks and your arteries are forming a union. But nothing defines frontier cuisine like stew. Glorious, mysterious stew, always bubbling. Never questioned. You don't ask what's in it. You survive what's in it. If it crunches, just keep chewing. If it moves, pretend it didn't. If someone swears it tastes like chicken, they either have a generous imagination or a very low opinion of poultry. Dessert? That's adorable. The closest thing to dessert is hardtack dipped in rainwater, or maybe some old molasses you traded a boot for. If you managed to find a pie in the Wild West, it was probably baked by the devil or someone trying to kill a marshal. Now let's talk about coffee. Frontier coffee is less of a beverage and more of a philosophical test. It's blacker than night, thicker than motor oil, and brewed in a pot that hasn't been washed since the war. It'll wake you up, clear your sinuses, and possibly reset your memory. In the Wild West, your horse isn't just your transportation. It's your roommate, therapist, security system, and occasionally, the only thing in your life with a functioning survival instinct. Let's be clear. Your horse doesn't trust you, and frankly, it shouldn't. You're a bipedal liability who thinks riding into an unfamiliar canyon at dusk is a good idea. Your horse, meanwhile, knows the last 3 people who tried that are currently buzzard snacks. This creature, muddy, stubborn, and with the attitude of an exhausted schoolteacher, is smarter than you, more aware of its surroundings, and infinitely more judgmental. Horses sense danger before you do. They hear distant rustling, feel vibrations in the earth, and can tell when something's about to go terribly wrong. You? You're still admiring the view and wondering where that coyote choir is coming from. If your horse suddenly stops moving, it's not broken. It's warning you. If it turns around on its own, let it. It's not being dramatic. It's saving your sorry hide. And if it throws you, assume you were about to walk into something fatal and thank it on the way down. Feeding your horse matters too. Hay, oats, maybe an apple if you want to earn a look of mild approval. But don't expect affection. This isn't a dog. This is a 1 to 200 pound animal that will carry you over mountains, through rivers, and straight into danger. But it will not cuddle. And for heaven's sake, don't name it something cute like Snickerdoodle. Name it something serious like Dustbite, or Widowmaker, or Jeff. Something with weight. This horse will be with you longer than most friends and all romantic partners. Maintenance is key. Brush it. Check its hooves. Talk to it occasionally. Not because it enjoys it, but because it needs to know you're not a complete idiot. Trust is earned, and your horse has higher standards than most sheriffs. In the Wild West, carrying a weapon wasn't just about self-defense. It was about social camouflage. Not having one was the equivalent of walking into a saloon with "Hello, I am vulnerable" stitched on your hat. Now, whether you actually know how to use a weapon, that's optional. Most folks didn't. Half of them couldn't hit a barn wall from the inside. But that didn't matter. The point was to look like you could, or at least look like you were willing to start something deeply unwise. So yes, carry a gun. A pistol, preferably. Worn, scratched, maybe missing a screw. Something that says, "I've seen things," even if the only thing it's seen is your reflection while practicing cool poses in the mirror. And don't forget to wear it like you've always had one. Let it hang loose, slightly askew, like a lazy threat. If you strap it on like it's your first communion gift, everyone will know you're bluffing and adjust their robbery schedule accordingly. Can't afford a pistol? Carry a knife. Rusty is fine. Decorative is suspicious. If it folds, flick it open once in a while and stare into the distance like you're remembering something traumatic. It doesn't matter what, just look complicated. Still broke? Improvise. A sharpened spoon, a slingshot, a stick with nails in it. Anything you can wave around when negotiations turn loud. Bonus points if it looks homemade and unstable. But remember, you don't actually want to use it. Fights are loud, messy, and statistically unwise. Your weapon is for show. It's a conversation ender, a walking insurance policy. It should say, "I'm not worth the trouble," not, "Please test my reflexes." That said, if you do pull it out, commit. Nothing is more embarrassing than drawing a weapon and realizing you forgot how it works. Or worse, that it's not loaded. Don't be that guy. He's usually buried near the outhouse. Trust is a fragile thing out west, like a whiskey bottle on a poker table or a wagon wheel held together with hope. And if someone introduces themselves as Doc, Dutch, or Dusty, congratulations. You've just met someone who will definitely get you into trouble, and possibly into a shallow grave. Let's start with Doc. Sounds respectable, right? Wrong. Doc is not a doctor. He may have once looked at a medical book. He may have removed a bullet with a spoon, but more likely, he's just the guy with the steadiest hands during hangovers. If Doc offers you whiskey for the pain, it means he's about to amputate something, possibly by mistake. Then there's Dutch. No one knows why he's called Dutch. He's not from Holland. He doesn't speak Dutch. But he always has a plan. And that plan always ends with you hiding in a hayloft while Dutch rides off with the loot, your horse, and a heartfelt apology that sounds rehearsed. Never follow Dutch, especially if he starts a sentence with, "Here's what we're gonna do." Now let's talk about Dusty. Dusty earned that name because he hasn't bathed since the invention of rope. He knows every back trail, every trick, and every wanted poster with his face on it. He's friendly, too friendly. He'll offer to split beans, share firewood, even guard your mule. But the moment you blink, he'll be gone. With your boots, your rifle, and a heartfelt note that just says, "Thanks." Here's the rule. If someone introduces themselves with a nickname, assume it came from either a long criminal history or one very memorable bar fight. Trust only people who go by full names and nervously correct you when you shorten them. Because out here, nicknames are currency. And anyone named Whiskey Pete, Rattlesnake Joe, or Sweet Lou has either killed a man or is about to convince you to do it. So smile, nod, and sleep with one eye open. And if Doc, Dutch, and Dusty all show up at once, leave the fire, take the beans, and run. In the Wild West, gambling wasn't just a pastime. It was a group activity where everyone pretended to understand the rules until someone pulled a gun. Let's start with Faro, the most popular game in the saloon, and also the least understood. It involves cards, bets, and lots of shouting. The rules are simple. Lose slowly or lose fast. Either way, your money ends up in the same place, someone else's whiskey fund. You might think, I'm good at poker. That's adorable. Faro is poker's chaotic cousin, raised by wolves and trained in passive aggression. It moves fast, has its own lingo, and is often managed by a dealer who's both charming and very possibly cheating. Now here's a fun fact. The saloon always wins. Even if you do get lucky, don't celebrate. Celebrating draws attention. Attention draws envy. Envy draws bullets. If you win, leave. Quietly. Walk like nothing happened. Tip the dealer, smile like a monk, and disappear into the night before someone starts wondering how your luck got that good. Of course, games of chance aren't limited to cards. There's dice, knife throwing, who can drink the most without dying, and the always thrilling, what's in this stew? All high risk, low reward, and medically inadvisable. But let's not forget the ultimate gamble: marriage. In the Wild West, getting married was basically signing a lifelong treaty with someone who probably smells like horse and has unresolved trauma involving bears. The ceremony is quick, the paperwork non-existent, and the fallout legendary. Sure, some folks find love. Others find out their spouse has 3 aliases, 5 debts, and 1 angry ex with a shotgun named Martha. You'll know it's serious when you wake up one day and your horse is gone, but your new in-laws aren't. If you don't know the rules, don't play. If the stakes seem low, look again. They're probably hidden under the table. And if a stranger named Slim offers to teach you a fun game, check for the nearest exit and start walking. Because in the Wild West, everything's a gamble, especially commitment. The Wild West may look vast and romantic in paintings, but out here, the weather is basically mood swings with atmospheric violence. Let's begin with the heat. Summer in the frontier isn't warm. It's a full-body hallucination where your boots melt into the dirt and your hat becomes less fashion and more survival dome. Shade is a rare, moving target, usually occupied by a rattlesnake with tenure. You'll sweat through leather. Your canteen will feel like a cruel joke. And no matter how much you drink, you'll never feel hydrated, just slightly damp and very concerned. Then comes the wind, which doesn't just blow. It scours. It blasts sand into your teeth, your coffee, your soul. It finds your one exposed patch of skin and exfoliates it down to regret. Locals refer to it as the breeze, which is adorable in the same way a stampede is called a jog. But wait, let's not forget rain, that rare and deeply suspicious event. When it comes, it doesn't trickle politely. It arrives with biblical vengeance, turning the ground into soup and your tent into a water feature. Roads vanish. Mules panic. You discover your boots are in fact waterproof. In the same way a sponge is waterproof. And then there's winter. Snow in the west isn't fluffy or magical. It's a silent assassin. It shows up without warning, buries everything, and turns your daily routine into a survival drama. Water freezes. Fingers go numb. You start naming your firewood for company. Pro tip: never trust a blue sky. It's a trap. You'll step outside thinking, what a nice day, only to be chased by lightning, hail, or a dust devil that wants your hat and possibly your soul. Out here, weather isn't something you enjoy, it's something you endure. The sun bakes you, the wind peels you, and the rain mocks you. Your wardrobe is never right, your gear is always wet, and your mood is permanently weather-aware. The movies got it wrong. In the Wild West, no one actually shouts, "I'm outta here," and storms off into the sunset with dramatic music swelling. You know what happens to those people? They get followed, or worse, remembered. The real pros? They leave like ghosts. No farewell speeches, no eye contact, and absolutely no final drink at the bar. You settle your tab early, nod to no one in particular, and disappear into the horizon like a man with debts, secrets, and a healthy respect for survival. You see, staying too long in any town is a gamble. The longer you linger, the more likely someone will decide you look like a guy they used to hate, or owe money to, or swore revenge on during a particularly emotional card game. Best case scenario, they just want your horse. So when the signs start showing, when the saloon piano stops mid-song as you walk in, when the sheriff asks where you're from again, or when a stranger keeps flipping a coin while staring directly at your boots, it's time to saddle up. Quiet departures are an art form. You pack your things before dawn. You don't make a sound. You leave behind anything noisy, sentimental, or flammable. If you must say goodbye, make it vague. I got business east. That could mean anything: trade, trouble, or just a powerful desire to not be shot at breakfast. And don't look back. Nothing meaningful is ever behind you in the Wild West, except poor choices and people who can't shoot straight but try anyway. Want to make a reputation? Stay and fight? Want to survive past 40? Ride away while no one's watching? The only thing better than a legacy is a pulse. Even better, leave before you're expected to. Depart mid-conversation, mid-drink, mid-chicken. They'll spend days wondering where you went and whether they should follow. They shouldn't. In a saloon full of big hats and bigger mouths, it's easy to be distracted by the loudest guy in the room. He's usually the one telling a story about how he fought off 3 Apaches, 2 bounty hunters, and a thunderstorm, all before breakfast. Ignore him. He'll be dead by Friday. No, the real danger is the man in the corner, the one nursing the same drink for an hour, the one who hasn't said a word, hasn't blinked since you walked in, and who may or may not have been carved from tree bark. That's the one who's survived 5 shootouts, 3 ambushes, and 1 marriage. He's not quiet because he's shy. He's quiet because words waste oxygen, and he's saving his breath for when someone needs burying. You see, in the Wild West, talkers talk, but quiet men plan. They size you up. They count how many steps to the door. They know which floorboard squeaks and where the nearest gun is, even if it's yours. It's easy to mistake silence for peace. Big mistake. The loud ones cause the fights. The quiet ones end them. Swiftly, efficiently, and usually before the bartender has time to duck. And don't think you're in the clear just because someone's polite. Yes, man, doesn't mean he won't shoot you through the soup bowl if he thinks you're reaching for something. In the West, civility is just a sheath for violence. If a man turns down a drink, nods without smiling, and leaves his hat on even inside, be respectful. Be cautious. And under no circumstance should you challenge him to anything. Not poker, not horseshoes, not even small talk. Because there's a reason the cemetery is full of loud men, and the quiet ones are still riding. In the Wild West, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a lifestyle, an excuse, and occasionally a court defense. Shot a hole through the saloon wall. Whiskey. Married a stranger in a poker haze. Whiskey. Woke up pantsless next to a cactus and a goat named Tobias. Definitely whiskey. Blaming the whiskey is a time-honored tradition out here. It's the Cowboys' version of "my dog ate it." And the best part? People accept it. No one expects great decisions from a man who's been sipping firewater since sunrise. Now, don't confuse whiskey with flavor. It tastes like regret and burns like honesty, but it does the job. It numbs the senses, blurs your memory, and temporarily turns terrible ideas into excellent ones. You'll find yourself thinking, yes, I can jump across that ravine, or, sure, I trust this stranger with face tattoos and no eyebrows. Whiskey is also the great social equalizer. You could be a ranch hand, a gunfighter, or the town mayor. By the third shot, everyone's slurring the same song and arm wrestling the same table. It brings people together, briefly, just before the chairs start flying. If someone calls you out for bad behavior, just say, I don't remember. Must have been the whiskey. No one will question it. Not even the sheriff, who's likely nursing his own flask of plausible deniability. But beware, whiskey doesn't solve problems. It postpones them until they return with interest, usually holding a grudge and a rope. And it has a funny habit of turning just one drink into, why is the jailer calling me by my first name? Still, the frontier code remains. When reality becomes inconvenient, whiskey is the scapegoat. Blame it freely, blame it often, and never let facts interfere with a good story. Just remember, the morning after, that's on you. Whiskey won't explain the bruises, the debts, or why you now apparently own half a mule trading business. So raise a glass, take a sip, and prepare to blame the bottle. Because out here, whiskey doesn't fix your life. It just makes you too dizzy to notice it's broken. In the Wild West, everybody wanted to be a legend, until they saw how legends usually ended, dramatic, painful, and frequently involving at least one angry husband. So if you really want to survive the frontier, stay forgettable. Be the guy nobody remembers, the one who never won the duel, never robbed the bank, and never caused a scene at the saloon. In other words, live like a shadow, die like a rumor. You see, fame out here is a death sentence with a slow delivery time. The moment your name gets around, it becomes a challenge. Some hot-headed kid who's never tasted real hardship will show up one day, squinting dramatically, and demand a duel at high noon. Why? Because you once shot a can off a fence and someone told a story about it. Every outlaw with a nickname ends up on a poster. Every hero ends up in a showdown. But the man who minds his business, mends his boots, and tips his hat without flair, he gets to ride into the next town without anyone remembering what he looked like. That's freedom. Not the kind with fireworks and speeches, the kind where no one's chasing you with a rope or a grudge. So skip the flair. Don't carve your name into the saloon table. Don't try to impress people with your backstory. No one's buying that you were raised by wolves and educated by monks. Just keep your head down, your horse fed, and your mouth mostly shut. Let others chase glory. Let them pose dramatically in the sunset and get poetic about living fast. You'll be 3 towns away, sipping coffee that doesn't taste like gunpowder and sleeping in a bed that doesn't have your name etched into the frame. Because here's the real trick to surviving the Wild West. Don't be interesting. Be competent, be courteous, and be gone before anyone gets too curious. And if someone asks about your past, shrug. Say, it wasn't much. Then change the subject to the weather, which, as we know, is probably trying to kill you anyway. Because out here, it's not about going down in history. It's about not going down at all. In the year 69 BCE, a girl was born into the royal palace of Alexandria, who would one day seduce the world, not just with her beauty, as legend loves to exaggerate, but with her mind, her voice, and her terrifying ability to stay alive. Her name? Cleopatra the 7th Philopator. The name alone sounded divine, and she would live up to it. But first, chaos. She was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a long line of Macedonian Greeks who'd ruled Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great. They were Greek in blood, Egyptian in dress, and dysfunctional in the way only royal families can be. Picture a household where everyone's either marrying their sibling or plotting to poison them. That was the Ptolemaic brand. And Cleopatra. She was the sharpest dagger at the table. Her father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, or the flute player, yes, really, was more interested in music than governing. He secured Roman backing by bribing senators so aggressively it left Egypt nearly bankrupt. When angry mobs rose against him, he fled the country like a flautist from a fire. Cleopatra was around 11 when she saw firsthand how unstable thrones could be, and she was taking notes. What made Cleopatra stand out wasn't just survival instinct. Unlike her predecessors, she actually learned the Egyptian language. Most Ptolemies couldn't be bothered. They saw themselves as Greek rulers sitting atop a foreign nation. Cleopatra. She embraced Egypt. She spoke to the people in their own tongue, styled herself as the goddess Isis, and studied everything from astronomy to pharmacology. She was being trained not just to rule, but to outlive her enemies. Behind those palace walls, Cleopatra witnessed a masterclass in political paranoia. Brothers betrayed sisters. Sisters poisoned nephews. The servants kept their mouths shut and their heads low. Cleopatra, however, walked through the snake pit with her eyes wide open. She wasn't waiting to inherit power. She was learning how to seize it. In a world where women were expected to smile and stay silent, Cleopatra was already planning her speeches. She would not be the wife of a pharaoh. She would be the pharaoh. And as Egypt teetered on the brink of civil war and Roman ambition loomed ever larger, the girl born in chaos prepared to become its storm. Upon her father's death in 51 BCE, Cleopatra VII found herself co-ruler of Egypt, on paper at least. The arrangement, dictated by her father's will and rubber-stamped by Rome, forced her to share the throne with her 10-year-old brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII. Yes, brother-husband. Welcome back to the Ptolemaic family tree, which looked less like a tree and more like a tangled shrub of incest and assassinations. Initially, Cleopatra tried to assert herself as the primary ruler. Her face appeared alone on some early coins, which in ancient monarchic PR meant, "This is my empire now." But her advisors, many of them loyal to her brother's regents, had other plans. Within a year or two, she was exiled from Alexandria altogether, tossed out of her own palace by a cabal of teenage boys in togas and men who smelled like stale wine and ambition. Cleopatra didn't cry. She didn't grovel. She didn't even try to sneak back in through the kitchen. Instead, she fled to Syria and began raising her own army. Because when you're 21, recently dethroned, and your enemies wear eyeliner, sometimes the best revenge is mercenaries. Back in Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII's court was a bubbling stew of incompetence and insecurity. His advisors, particularly a man named Pothinus, believed they could control the boy king like a puppet. Unfortunately, they failed to anticipate that Cleopatra, young, furious, and frighteningly well-read, wasn't finished. She marched her forces to Egypt's eastern border, preparing for civil war. The Nile would run with gold, lies, and probably a few severed limbs. But just as tensions reached a boiling point, an unexpected guest arrived on Egyptian shores, Julius Caesar. The Roman general had just chased his rival, Pompey the Great, into Egypt, only to discover that Ptolemy's advisors had helpfully murdered Pompey before he got there. Caesar was horrified. He hadn't wanted Pompey dead yet, certainly not as a diplomatic welcome gift. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew opportunity when she saw it. Caesar was powerful. Rome was watching, and she had no intention of remaining in exile. What came next would become legend. A carpet, a secret entrance, and one of the most theatrical entrances in political history. The sibling war was about to be interrupted by romance, propaganda, and a Roman named Julius. If you're imagining Cleopatra sneaking into Julius Caesar's quarters rolled up in a carpet, congratulations. You've been infected by ancient gossip and Renaissance painting. The actual method may have involved a sack or a linen bundle, but the message was the same. Cleopatra didn't knock. She entered. She was 21. Caesar was 52. He was fresh off a civil war, exhausted, politically radioactive, and probably not in the mood for palace drama. But Cleopatra knew exactly what kind of man he was, and more importantly, what kind of empire he came from. Rome respected cunning. Rome admired boldness. Rome couldn't resist a good story. And Cleopatra? She was about to make herself one. By the time Caesar finished his first conversation with her, he wasn't just intrigued, he was committed. Committed enough to station himself in Alexandria, declare neutrality in the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, and quietly begin favoring her in every way that mattered. Ptolemy XIII, meanwhile, fumed from across the city, probably wondering why Caesar was dining with his sister while he sat on the wrong side of the Nile with an increasingly restless army. Then came the fighting. Ptolemy's forces surrounded the palace, igniting what would become the Alexandrian War. For months, Caesar and a small Roman garrison were under siege in a foreign city, defending the palace alongside Cleopatra's loyalists. At one point, Caesar even ordered part of the Alexandrian harbour set ablaze to secure supply lines, accidentally torching part of the Library of Alexandria in the process. Oops. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy's forces were crushed in a final chaotic battle. The boy king drowned trying to flee, dragged under by his own armour. Cleopatra, now rid of her brother-husband, was suddenly sole ruler again. Well, almost. In true Ptolemaic tradition, she had to marry another brother. This time it was Ptolemy XIV, aged about 12, who posed even less of a threat. Cleopatra ruled. He stayed out of the way. And what about Caesar? He lingered. For months. Some said he was entranced, others said he was calculating. But Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar, and named him publicly as Caesar's heir. Whether Caesar acknowledged the boy in private or not, in Egypt, Cleopatra made sure everyone knew. Rome had given her a child. Egypt had a prince. And she had just rewritten the future. After the dust of the Alexandrian War settled, Cleopatra VII was firmly in control of Egypt. But she wasn't content with being queen of just the Nile. No, her ambitions stretched beyond sand and pyramids. She wanted to be seen by Rome, admired, respected, and maybe just a little feared. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra sailed to Rome. Not quietly, not modestly. This was Cleopatra, after all. She arrived on a regal barge, with an entourage that sparkled and gossiped and made the Roman elite clutch their pearls. And behind her came her toddler son, Caesarion, whose very existence was a problem. Because Julius Caesar already had an official heir in Rome, his grandnephew Octavian. Still, Caesar welcomed Cleopatra. He gave her a villa just across the Tiber from his own. They dined, schemed, and whispered behind closed doors, while Roman senators muttered into their goblets of watered wine. Cleopatra was not a Roman wife. She wasn't even a Roman citizen. She was, to conservative eyes, a foreign temptress playing queen in the heart of the Republic. Public opinion turned sour. The people admired Caesar, but they didn't love what he was becoming. A man who wore purple robes, sat on a golden chair, and entertained a queen like a pharaoh himself. Cleopatra, with her divine airs and exotic rituals, only added fuel to the fire. To some, she was the embodiment of Rome's worst fear, monarchy in silk and eyeliner. And then came the Ides of March. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who thought they were saving the Republic. Cleopatra, still in Rome, suddenly found herself in danger, with no protector, no allies, and a child who might now be considered a threat. She fled. Back to Alexandria. Back to the kingdom she actually ruled. There was no mourning parade, no grand farewell. But Cleopatra didn't leave empty-handed. She had Caesarion, and more importantly, she had narrative. In Egypt, she proclaimed her son not just as Caesar's child, but as his rightful heir. Let Rome argue, let Octavian pout. Cleopatra had survived yet another political earthquake, and now she would prepare Egypt for a future in which her bloodline, not Rome's, would dominate the Mediterranean. At least, that was the plan. After Caesar's assassination, Rome turned into a meat grinder of ambition. On one side was Octavian, young, calculating, and inconveniently Caesar's named heir. On the other was Mark Antony, older, charismatic, and a general with the loyalty of the legions and the drinking habits of a satyr on vacation. Cleopatra watched this chaos from Alexandria, calculating her next move like a seasoned chess master with cobra-shaped pieces. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus to explain her alleged support for Caesar's enemies. She could have sent a scroll. She sent herself instead, on a golden barge, sails scented with incense, dressed as the goddess Isis, reclining under a canopy like she'd invented divine appearances and velvet cushions. It wasn't diplomacy, it was theatre. And Antony, lover of spectacle and wine, was utterly captivated. Cleopatra didn't grovel or negotiate, she dazzled. Within days, Antony forgot about the interrogation and became her companion, her lover, and eventually, her political ally. He followed her back to Alexandria like a toga-clad puppy, where they spent the winter feasting, drinking, and co-creating a sort of royal frat party known as the Inimitable Livers. Cleopatra wasn't just seducing a man, she was binding Roman power to Egyptian interests. The relationship was more than pillow talk. Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a third son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. She now had a dynasty with Roman blood. Antony, meanwhile, had officially abandoned his Roman wife, Octavian's sister no less, setting Rome's teeth further on edge. The tabloids, if papyrus had gossip columns, would have exploded. But Cleopatra wasn't just interested in romance. She wanted protection for Egypt and expansion of her territory. Antony granted her lands, Cyprus, parts of Syria, even parts of Arabia. To Rome, it looked like he was handing over chunks of the empire to his exotic mistress. To Cleopatra, it looked like success. Back in Rome, Octavian simmered. Antony was supposed to be his ally. Instead, he was throwing kingdoms around like party favors and living like a Hellenistic rock star in Alexandria. The stage was set. The political triangle between Cleopatra, Antony, and Octavian would soon collapse into something more destructive. For now, Cleopatra had love, land, and legitimacy. But in Rome, knives were being sharpened. Again. By 34 BCE, Cleopatra was no longer just Queen of Egypt. She was Queen of Kings. Literally. That year, in a lavish ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria, Mark Antony stood beside her, dressed in Roman garb but acting like an Eastern monarch, and publicly handed out territories to Cleopatra's children as if he was Zeus with a map. Caesarion, her eldest son with Julius Caesar, was proclaimed King of Kings. Her twins with Antony received Armenia and Media. Her youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, got Syria and Cilicia, and Cleopatra herself. She was declared Queen of Kings, not just of Egypt, but of lands Rome considered its own. The crowd roared. Roman senators fumed. This wasn't a donation. It was a declaration. Cleopatra and Antony weren't just lovers. They were carving out a new Eastern Empire. To Octavian, this wasn't romantic. It was treason. The optics were damning. A Roman general seduced by a foreign queen, giving away Roman provinces to illegitimate children, while drinking himself senseless in an Alexandrian palace that smelled of lotus and revolution. Octavian, ever the spin doctor, seized the moment. He launched a public smear campaign, accusing Antony of betraying Roman values and naming Cleopatra as the snake behind the man. He even read Antony's will aloud in the Senate, conveniently obtained and possibly forged, which claimed Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. Scandalous, treasonous, perfect for stirring up Roman rage. War was inevitable. The Roman people, always suspicious of monarchs and women with ideas, rallied behind Octavian. He declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. This was strategic. By targeting a foreign queen, Octavian could frame the coming conflict as Rome versus an outsider, not another bloody civil war. And Cleopatra, she wasn't backing down. She sent ships, silver, and soldiers to support Antony's campaign. In 32 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony sailed together to confront Octavian's forces. They weren't just lovers anymore, they were military partners. But whispers of betrayal, desertion, and divine arrogance followed them like smoke. Cleopatra had risked everything, her throne, her children, her dynasty, for this alliance. The only question now was, would the gods favor love or empire? Spoiler: Rome rarely chooses love. In September of 31st BCE, the fate of Cleopatra and Mark Antony came down to one decisive moment: the Battle of Actium. It was supposed to be their grand military triumph, a bold stand against Octavian's rising Roman machine. Instead, it became a slow-motion disaster with oars. Their combined fleet, parked off the coast of western Greece, was impressive. Hundreds of warships, thousands of men, and enough Egyptian gold to make the gods blush. But it was also bloated, indecisive, and weighed down by conflicting egos. Cleopatra, commanding her own fleet, wasn't just there for decoration. She was funding the war, she was a queen on deck, and she was betting everything. Octavian's forces, led by his capable Admiral Agrippa, were leaner, faster, and far better coordinated. They cut off supply lines, harassed enemy ships, and outmaneuvered Antony's sluggish galleys. Meanwhile, Antony's men were starving, demoralized, and wondering if their general was more focused on Cleopatra's eyes than on naval strategy. Then came the moment of infamy. During the heat of the battle, Cleopatra's fleet suddenly turned and fled the scene, heading south toward Egypt. Some say it was a planned maneuver, others claim it was panic. Antony, either overcome by devotion or sheer confusion, followed her, abandoning his fleet and turning a military contest into a humiliating rout. His soldiers, left behind, surrendered to Octavian. The war, in essence, was over. Rome had won. The queen and her general had sailed home not as victors, but as fugitives. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra tried to maintain control. She fortified the city. She sent envoys. She may have even considered Plan B, negotiating her survival by offering to hand Antony over to Octavian. But nothing worked. Octavian was coming, and this time there would be no carpets, no speeches, and no second chances. Mark Antony, humiliated and slipping into despair, blamed treachery and fate. Cleopatra watched her empire unravel like linen in a storm. Her sons, her living legacy, were now potential hostages. Her carefully constructed image as Queen of Kings was turning to ash. The woman who had once dazzled Caesar, seduced Antony, and defied Rome, was cornered. All that remained was how she would choose to fall. By the summer of 30 BCE, Alexandria was suffocating under the shadow of doom. Octavian's forces had crossed into Egypt. The city, once a glittering jewel of the ancient world, now braced for conquest. And inside the palace walls, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were unraveling. Antony, once Rome's most celebrated general, had become a ghost of himself. His pride was shattered. His army had either surrendered or defected. Rumors swirled that Cleopatra might strike a secret deal with Octavian, offering her throne and Antony's head as the price of her children's survival. The tension snapped on a single lie. A messenger falsely reported that Cleopatra had died, likely part of her own scheme to test Antony's loyalty or buy time. Whatever the plan, it backfired. Antony, devastated, did what Roman men were trained to do in the face of honor lost. He fell on his sword, but he didn't die. Bleeding and in agony, he was carried to Cleopatra's hidden mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with her remaining treasures. She refused to open the doors, fearing capture, so they hauled him up. Yes, literally pulled his bleeding body through a window, and there, in a gilded tomb meant for her, Mark Antony died in her arms. Roman tragedy doesn't get more theatrical than that. Octavian soon entered Alexandria. Cleopatra tried one last gamble. She met him, draped in royal robes, hoping to charm or bargain her way into survival, perhaps even power. But Octavian, unlike Caesar and Antony, wasn't moved by beauty or ceremony. He was cold, efficient, already writing her defeat into Roman history. He seized her children, annexed her empire, and made it clear she would be paraded through Rome as a trophy, a living symbol of Roman victory over Eastern decadence. Cleopatra had seen what Roman triumphs did to queens. Her sister Arsinoe had once walked that path in chains. Cleopatra would not. She arranged her own death with the precision of a ruler, not a victim. On August 12th, 30 BCE, at the age of 39, Cleopatra took her life, perhaps with a poisoned comb, perhaps with the bite of an asp. The method is uncertain. The message was not. If she could not rule in dignity, she would die as a queen. Cleopatra VII was dead. Her body, embalmed in secrecy and sorrow, was laid to rest beside Mark Antony, by her own request, and surprisingly, granted by Octavian. The queen and the general, who had once dreamed of carving out a new empire, were now buried in the ruins of their failed ambition. But death did not end Cleopatra's influence. If anything, it made her immortal. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, Rome's first emperor, had won. Egypt was now a Roman province. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, was executed quietly. The rest of her children were marched to Rome in chains and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife. History is cruel that way, yet Cleopatra refused to be erased. She lived on, not in monuments or statues, most were destroyed or repurposed, but in stories. In Roman propaganda, she was cast as a manipulative seductress who bewitched noblemen and led them astray. In art, she became the exotic queen, draped in jewels, clutching an asp to her breast. And in literature, she was tragic, romantic, dangerous, sometimes all at once. The real Cleopatra, of course, was more complicated. She was the last of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. She spoke 9 languages. She was a master of diplomacy, naval strategy, and survival in a world where rulers dropped like flies in honey. She outlived assassins, civil wars, and 2 of Rome's most powerful men. She ruled Egypt not as a puppet queen, but as a divine monarch who understood her people, played the long game, and dared to dream beyond the Nile. Her death marked the end of the Hellenistic age. With her gone, Egypt would never again be ruled by a native-born pharaoh. The temples would fall silent, the hieroglyphs would fade. But Cleopatra, clever, cunning, captivating Cleopatra, would remain. For centuries to come, she would be reimagined. As a harlot, a heroine, a goddess, a schemer. Shakespeare turned her into poetry. Hollywood turned her into a spectacle. And every generation, it seems, rediscovers her, trying to decide if she was a power-hungry seductress or a brilliant woman crushed by empire. Maybe she was both, but one thing is certain. When the ancient world gasped its last, it did so in Cleopatra's voice, or between the 8th and 14th centuries, the Islamic world blossomed into a cultural powerhouse. Spanning from the golden courts of Al-Andalus in modern-day Spain to the scholarly libraries of Baghdad, this vast civilization was not only trading silk and science, it was trading sound. Music wasn't background noise. It was medicine, mathematics, theology, and pleasure, all woven into a single tradition. Unlike in many medieval European contexts, where music often belonged strictly to churches or courts, the Islamic world embraced a more holistic approach. Music filled mosques, markets, palaces, and private homes. It was debated by philosophers, written about by doctors, and taught in madrasas, alongside astronomy and geometry. To the people of this world, sound was more than entertainment. It was a reflection of cosmic order, a mirror of the divine. Arabic music inherited much from its neighbours: Persian refinements, Byzantine modalities, Indian rhythms, but it didn't just borrow, it synthesized. Musicians and theorists developed complex scales called makamat, rhythmic cycles called ikat, and theories that described the emotional and even physical effects of different melodic forms. They wrote treatises explaining how a certain mode could ease sadness, invigorate tired limbs, or help the soul ascend to higher understanding. In the palaces of Damascus and Cordoba, caliphs hosted court musicians who were both performers and scholars. In fact, some rulers, like the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, considered musical patronage a sign of prestige. Instruments weren't just heard, they were honored. Poets compared them to the human voice, to birdsong, to divine whispers. The result? A musical tradition that was both deeply rooted in science and profoundly spiritual. Music was used to heal, to educate, to seduce, and to resist. It served as both a form of expression and a tool of empire, connecting Arabic-speaking cities with Persian poets, Berber drummers, and Andalusian string players. This was not a world of rigid notation or dusty scores. It was a world of improvisation, oral transmission, and living memory. Musicians learned by listening, repeating, and slowly becoming vessels for centuries of accumulated sound. Before we examine the instruments themselves, one thing is clear. The medieval Islamic world did not just have music, it lived in it. If the medieval Islamic world had a musical soul, it beat through the curved wooden body of the oud. Instantly recognizable with its pear-shaped form and short fretless neck, the oud was the undisputed king of instruments. Its sound was warm, resonant, and deeply human, like a voice singing without words. The oud wasn't just an instrument, it was a symbol of refinement, scholarship, and high culture. Poets wrote verses comparing it to the moon. Mystics claimed it brought them closer to the divine. In many ways, the oud was to the Islamic world what the piano later became to Europe, a central axis of composition, education, and experimentation. Its origins likely trace back to ancient Mesopotamia, but in the hands of Muslim craftsmen and musicians, the oud evolved into something transcendent. Constructed from fine woods like walnut, rosewood, or ebony, it typically featured 5 to 7 courses of strings, plucked with a feather or plectrum. The lack of frets allowed for the subtle microtones of the maqam system, an essential part of Arabic music that Western notation can barely capture. The most famous oud master of the Islamic Golden Age was Ziryab, a 9th century musician, polymath, and style icon. Born in Baghdad and flourishing in Cordoba, Ziryab revolutionized the Andalusian court with his musical innovations. He added a 5th string to the oud, introduced new modes, and even dictated rules for musicians' attire and grooming. If medieval Islamic music were a courtly drama, Ziryab was its most fashionable protagonist. But the oud wasn't confined to elite circles. Merchants played it. Soldiers played it. Sufi dervishes used it to accompany spiritual recitations. It was versatile, portable, and capable of expressing joy, grief, and everything in between. Through trade and conquest, the oud traveled. It entered Byzantine lands, crept into Sicily, and eventually reached Europe, where it morphed into the lute, a word derived directly from the Arabic al-oud. Renaissance and Baroque music owe much of their melodic intimacy to this humble ancestor. In a world of geometric tiles and calligraphic verses, the oud added something intangible: feeling. It didn't just echo across courtyards, it whispered through centuries, and where the oud laid the foundation, other instruments soon followed. If the oud was the heart, then the qanun was the mind of medieval Islamic music. Precise, articulate, and utterly mesmerizing. Flat, trapezoidal, and strung with dozens of tightly tuned strings, the qanun looked like a zither, but played like a calculated cascade of light and sound. Its name, derived from the Greek canon, meaning law or rule, was fitting. The qanun brought structure to ensemble performances. With its crisp, harp-like tone, it could carve clear melodic lines or shimmer beneath the oud in delicate harmony. No surprise that scholars and theorists gravitated toward it. It was the instrument of musical law. Typically, a kanun featured 26 courses of triple strings, meaning over 70 strings total, stretched over a light wooden soundboard. Players used tortoiseshell plectrums attached to their index fingers with rings. What emerged wasn't just a flurry of notes, but an ocean of carefully calibrated emotion. The player could pluck arpeggios like falling water or unleash dazzling runs that made palaces vibrate. Unlike the oud, the kanun relied on micro-adjustable levers or tuning bridges that allowed the musician to adapt quickly between maqamat, the subtle modal systems that defined Arabic, Turkish, and Persian music. This meant a skilled kanun player could shift emotional tone mid-performance, evoking awe in even the most jaded courtier. The kanun's cultural reach was wide. It was played from the Ottoman courts of Istanbul to the gardens of Fez. In Cairo, it was a mainstay in tacked ensembles. In Aleppo, it accompanied poets and vocalists during muwashshah recitations. Its crystalline sound blended beautifully with both vocals and other instruments, making it the bedrock of ensemble arrangements. More than once, travelers from Europe described the kanun with a mixture of admiration and confusion. How could something so mathematical sound so alive? How did the fingers move so fast? By the time European musicians tried to replicate it, it had already influenced early hammered dulcimers, harpsichords, and eventually the structure of the harpsichord itself. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the kanun was its dual identity. It was both a tool of measured discipline and a vessel of raw emotion. A scholar's instrument, yes, but also a lover's. Together with the oud, the kanun helped shape a world where music was not just heard, but felt. Among the instruments of the medieval Islamic world, the ney was the most spiritual. A simple reed flute with 7 holes and a breathy, melancholic voice, the ney wasn't just music, it was mysticism. Where the oud inspired movement and the kanun dazzled with structure, the ney whispered to the soul. The ney is one of the oldest instruments in continuous use, predating even Islam itself. But in the Islamic Golden Age, particularly in Persia and Anatolia, it found a new and deeper purpose. It was embraced by the Sufis, the mystical branch of Islam, as a symbol of the human condition. Hollow, fragile, and entirely dependent on the breath of the player, the ney became a metaphor for the soul animated by divine love. The Persian poet Rumi opened his most famous work, the Masnavi, with an ode to the ney. Listen to the reed flute, how it complains, lamenting its banishment from its home. That single line turned the ney into a spiritual icon, a symbol of longing for unity with God. Physically, the ney was modest. Made from a hollow cane or reed, cut and dried over many months, it required exceptional breath control to play. Unlike modern flutes, the ney's sound came not from mechanical precision, but from raw human effort, angled breath, shaped lips, and years of discipline. Mastery took a lifetime, and even then, every note trembled with vulnerability. In courts and caravans alike, the ney's sound was instantly recognizable. It was haunting, pained, and beautiful. In ensemble performances, it offered contrast to the sharper sounds of plucked strings. Alone, it could reduce listeners to silence. It wasn't uncommon for Sufi ceremonies, known as sama, to feature ney solos that were part prayer, part performance. In North Africa, the Maghreb adopted variations of the ney alongside other flutes. In the Ottoman Empire, it became part of classical Turkish music. Across the Islamic world, no serious musical tradition was complete without it. And while the oud was copied and the kanun adapted, the ney remained uniquely itself. Too fragile, too spiritual, too alive to be mass-produced. In the hands of a master, it didn't just play music. It told you who you were. If melody stirred the heart, rhythm stirred the body, and nothing embodied medieval Islamic rhythm like the frame drum and the rik. These instruments didn't just keep time. They carved it, shaped it, and danced within it. They were the heartbeat of the ensemble, found in the courts of Baghdad, the markets of Cairo, and the caravans rolling across the desert. The frame drum was as old as civilization itself. A circular wooden frame with stretched animal skin, played with fingers, palms, and sometimes even fists. Variants like the daf and bendir appeared across Persia, Iraq, and North Africa, each with its own style. Some were fitted with metal rings or gut snares to add texture, like footsteps in sand, or a rattlesnake whispering behind every beat. More refined was the rik, a type of tambourine found in the Arab world. But calling it a tambourine is like calling a calligrapher a doodler. It misses the point. The rik was made with meticulous care, a small wooden frame, goatskin head, and 5 sets of brass cymbals. It was light, portable, and deceptively powerful. In the hands of a master, the reku could simulate thunder or a soft breeze. It played the iko-a, the rhythmic cycles that underpinned Arabic music. These were not just beats per measure, but intricate patterns that defined mood, dance, and even poetic meter. Musicians memorized dozens of them, switching mid-performance with fluid grace. There was the stately samai, the lively maxim, and the hypnotic wahda. Each rhythm had its own personality, its own story. Drummers were not background musicians. They were conductors of emotion. A sudden pause in the rik cue could signal dramatic silence. A flurry of strokes could lift dancers into a trance. In Sufi rituals, frame drums summoned ecstasy. In Andalusian court music, they framed elegance. Women often played frame drums in domestic or ceremonial contexts, weddings, births, and festivals. Their rhythms echoed through homes and streets, blending the personal with the public. The impact of Islamic percussion traveled too. Frame drums found their way into Europe via Spain and Sicily. Renaissance music absorbed these pulses like spices in a stew. Without rhythm, melody drifts. But with a daf, or rik at its core, Islamic music moved like breath, measured, sacred, alive. While music permeated markets and homes, it reached its most opulent expression in the courts of caliphs and kings. These courts were not just seats of political power. They were cultural laboratories, where poets, scholars, and musicians mingled under chandeliers of brass and the scent of rosewater. In the Abbasid capital of Baghdad, the court of Harun al-Rashid became a beacon of artistic patronage. It was here that legendary musicians like Ishaq al-Mawsili refined the art of performance, theory, and composition. Musical evenings weren't casual entertainment. They were staged, strategic, and often lasted deep into the night. A single song could earn a musician a gold dinar or silent exile, depending on the mood of the caliph. The musicians who played in these courts weren't mere performers. They were respected intellectuals, often polymaths who could debate poetry, astrology, and metaphysics between songs. Their instruments were as polished as their language, and their performances balanced technical mastery with emotional intelligence. You didn't just need fingers, you needed philosophy. Further west, the courts of Al-Andalus, especially in Córdoba and Seville, elevated music to a political language. It was here that Ziryab, the taste-making exile from Baghdad, reshaped court life completely. He introduced musical modes, seasonal wardrobes, and even table manners. Imagine a man who could play 5 strings by morning and then dictate dessert etiquette by afternoon. That was Ziryab. Music in these courts was both spectacle and sophistication. It was used to impress ambassadors, seduce rivals, and show the wealth of one's intellect, not just one's treasury. Caliphs took pride in their orchestras, sometimes comprising dozens of musicians trained in a wide range of makamat and ikat. Women also played prominent roles, especially in private gatherings and majalis or salons. Some were enslaved courtesans trained from childhood in poetry, music, and etiquette. These Kian were prized not just for beauty, but for wit and artistry. Their music could flatter a guest or offer veiled political critique behind metaphor-laced verses. These courts weren't just collecting art, they were generating it. And as court life flourished, music became both a reflection of power and a tool to wield it. Behind every golden throne, it seemed, there was a well-tuned oud waiting for its cue. While the courts of caliphs shimmered with polished performance, music also pulsed through the dusty streets and crowded markets of the medieval Islamic world. In these more humble spaces, music was alive in a different way. Raw, rhythmic, spontaneous, and often loud enough to compete with clanging blacksmiths and braying camels. In marketplaces, known as souks or bazaars, music served a practical and emotional purpose. Traveling musicians, some professionals, some beggars, played for coins and attention. They sang ballads of love, parables or current events, sometimes making fun of politicians or praising local heroes. The instruments were portable: small frame drums, reed flutes, fiddles, and occasionally the rabab, a spiked fiddle with a voice as scratchy as a gossiping neighbor. Music in the streets wasn't always formal. It was a part of life. Children learned songs while playing. Merchants hummed as they set up stalls. Camel drivers used rhythmic chants to coordinate movement across long journeys. Music was mnemonic. It taught values, preserved local history, and reminded people when to wake, pray, and rest. Religious music had its own place, though with more nuance. The adhan, or Islamic call to prayer, though not technically music, was, and still is, deeply melodic. Delivered 5 times a day from minarets, the adhan followed specific melodic contours based on regional style. It wasn't improvisation for fun. It was an invocation of the sacred. Within Sufi traditions, however, music entered the mosque itself. The sama, a spiritual concert, combined chanting, recitation, and sometimes instrumental accompaniment. The goal wasn't applause, but annihilation of the self in divine ecstasy. Here, the ney and the daf weren't mere instruments. They were bridges between the seen and the unseen. Still, music also had its critics. Certain conservative scholars, including figures like Ibn Taymiyyah, denounced music as a distraction from spiritual discipline. Others debated which instruments were halal, permissible, or haram, forbidden. The debate was never settled, and the rules varied by time, region, and ruler. Yet despite the arguments, the music never stopped. It spilled into weddings, processions, harvest festivals, and funerals. It crept into alleyways and echoed from balconies. While scholars argued doctrine, people played. In short, if courts curated music, the streets lived it. In the medieval Islamic world, music wasn't just an art. It was a science, literally. From the academies of Baghdad to the observatories of Toledo, scholars explored music with the same seriousness they gave astronomy, algebra, and medicine. In their eyes, sound was not merely heard. It was measured, theorized, and even used to heal. One of the most influential thinkers was Al-Farabi, a philosopher and polymath who lived in the 10th century. In his Kitab al-Musika al-Kabir, the great book of music, Al-Farabi didn't just describe instruments. He mapped out the physics of sound, the emotional qualities of different maqamat, and the impact of melody on the human spirit. His work wasn't entertainment journalism. It was philosophy, geometry, and psychology in one. Following him came Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the famous Persian physician and thinker, who included music in his canon of medicine. According to Avicenna, the right melody could regulate the humors of the body, reduce anxiety, and even aid digestion. That's right, healing through harmonics. Long before Spotify's chill beats to relax and study to, medieval hospitals had their own live musicians to calm patients and promote recovery. Music was also tied to mathematics. Following the tradition of Pythagoras, Islamic scholars believed that harmony in sound reflected harmony in the cosmos. Ratios between string lengths, vibrations, and tones were seen as reflections of divine order. In essence, the universe itself was humming, and the human ear was simply catching a whisper of that celestial rhythm. Instruments, too, were constructed with mathematical precision. Luthiers, instrument makers, used proportions and measurements that mirrored those used in architecture and astronomy. Every oud, every kanun was a formula you could strum. Music theory books flourished, written in Arabic, Persian, and later Ottoman Turkish. These weren't just manuals, they were treatises filled with diagrams, philosophical arguments, and musical notation systems unique to the region. They showed scales, intervals, rhythms, and their theoretical impact on mood, health, and morality. This fusion of sound and science wasn't an accident. It reflected a worldview where knowledge was unified. Medicine, music, and metaphysics weren't separate disciplines. They were harmonies in the same divine song. So when the ode played or the ney wept, it wasn't just music. It was a reflection of the universe itself. As the medieval Islamic world flourished, its music didn't remain contained within its borders. It traveled, by caravan, by sea, and through conquest and cultural exchange. And with it went the instruments, the theories, the rhythms, and the very spirit of a civilization that saw music as both divine and mathematical. The most direct and lasting influence landed in Europe, particularly through Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. Cities like Córdoba, Granada, and Seville became cultural melting pots where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish musicians shared scales, borrowed melodies, and translated each other's treatises. The oud morphed into the lute, which became central to Renaissance music. Rhythmic patterns rooted in ikat found their way into medieval troubadour traditions. Even the makam system whispered into early European modes. Meanwhile, the kanun influenced the development of the harpsichord and dulcimer. The rabab, an early bowed instrument, was a distant ancestor of the violin. The ney and frame drums appeared in religious and folk contexts from the Balkans to Central Asia. In short, the legacy was everywhere. You just had to listen carefully. But the influence wasn't one way. As the Islamic world absorbed Greek, Persian, Indian, and Turkic musical ideas, it became a global repository of sound. Its theorists preserved ancient knowledge and expanded it. Its craftsmen refined instruments that would echo through centuries. The tradition continues today. In Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Morocco, and Andalusia, classical and folk traditions rooted in medieval music still survive. The ode remains beloved. The kanun and ney continue to be taught, played, and revered. Contemporary artists experiment with fusing electronic beats with ancient makamat. The beat goes on, but with deep historical roots. And perhaps what's most remarkable is the unity of the system. Across continents and centuries, this music retained its intellectual core. Improvisation with structure, spirituality with science, emotion with discipline. It was never just about performance. It was about meaning. In a time often remembered for swords and minarets, it's easy to forget that one of the most powerful exports of the medieval Islamic world wasn't steel or scripture, but sound. Crafted with care, carried by breath and string, and preserved in memory. 1,000 years later, we still hear its echo, not just in museums or manuscripts, but in music that speaks across time. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't about candlelit dinners or heartfelt vows. It was a legally binding alliance, a transaction wrapped in ceremony and sealed with property. If a Roman ever said, "I love you," they likely meant, "You have an excellent dowry and your father's land connects nicely with mine." Marriage, matrimonium, wasn't private. It was political. Families married to advance status, forge alliances, and create heirs to carry the family name, nomen. Senators married to gain votes. Generals married for legitimacy. Even emperors married for image control. If affection grew between spouses, great. But love was optional. Fidelity, even more so. There were several types of Roman marriage, but two stand out. First, cum manu, literally with hand, where the wife passed from the legal authority, potestas, of her father to that of her husband. In this form, the woman was effectively adopted into her husband's family, losing her inheritance rights in her natal household. Romantic, right? The second, and eventually more popular, was sine manu, without hand, where the wife remained legally under her father's control. This gave her more financial independence and allowed her to retain property and legal identity. Upper-class women eventually favored this style, especially as Roman women began to wield more quiet power in social and financial spheres. The ceremony itself, known as the confariatio, if done religiously, involved a priest, a shared cake made of spelt, and the symbolic joining of hands. But don't let the baked goods fool you. This wasn't a spiritual union. It was a public contract. Witnesses were required, and the contract included meticulous dowry records. Ah, yes, the dowry, the glue that held it all together. It was a payment from the bride's family to the groom to support the household. And if a divorce happened, which it often did, that dowry became a battleground. Keeping it could bankrupt a woman's family. Giving it back could embarrass the man. Nothing said, "It's over," like returning the furniture. In short, Roman marriage was love with a ledger. It served society, not sentiment. Husbands could be cold, wives could be strategic. And still, everyone played the part, because in Rome, even marriage was theatre. And when the performance went stale, divorce was just a formality. If you were a respectable Roman man in search of a wife, love was rarely on your checklist. Instead, you were hunting for something more practical: fertility, family connections, and a respectable name. A pleasant personality was a bonus, like finding out your ox could sing. Among the Roman elite, marriages were often arranged when the bride was still a child. A father might betroth his daughter at age 10 or 12, with marriage following shortly after puberty. Why the rush? Because in Roman society, the earlier you married off your daughter, the sooner she could start producing legitimate male heirs, which, let's be honest, was the whole point. What mattered most in a bride? First, lineage. A noble family name could elevate your political prospects overnight. Marrying the daughter of a senator or former consul wasn't just a social step up, it was a career move. Second, fertility. Romans wanted wives who could bear children, preferably many, and preferably sons. The state even passed laws to reward women for having 3 or more children. Augustus, ever the social engineer, implemented the Lex Julia and Lex Poppaea Poppaea, giving tax benefits and inheritance rights to prolific breeders. A Roman uterus was, essentially, public policy. Third, and never least, the dowry. Wealth came with the bride, and the larger the dowry, the more attractive the match. Some families even used marriage as a way to launder wealth and consolidate estates. You weren't just marrying the girl, you were marrying the farmland, the slaves, and the silver tableware. And what about the bride's opinion, occasionally taken into account? Especially in sine manu marriages, where elite women could exercise some agency, a girl might reject a match if her family allowed it. But more often, she was a pawn on a marble chessboard, moved strategically, then expected to smile. Beauty helped, of course. A well-groomed daughter with clear skin, good teeth, and a modest demeanor stood a better chance of being chosen. But beauty without pedigree or dowry, useless. It was the ancient Roman version of being Instagram famous, but broke. In the end, a Roman wife was chosen for what she could offer the household, not the heart. And once she entered that household, expectations were sky high. In ancient Rome, weddings were not private affairs whispered under olive trees. They were public performances, social contracts dressed in white wool and political subtext. A Roman wedding was equal parts religious ritual, family negotiation, and upper-class networking event, with the bride caught somewhere between a blessing and a bargaining chip. The process began with the sponsalia, a formal engagement that could be sealed with a handshake or even a written promise. Fathers agreed, witnesses nodded, and the future bride often had little say. The groom was usually in his 20s or 30s, the bride, frequently in her early teens. Nothing like starting a lifelong bond before you've finished your childhood. The main event was the nuptia, and it came with all the ceremonial bells and whistles, minus the actual bells. The bride wore a white tunic, tunica recta, tied with a special knot of Hercules, which symbolized fertility and also required a bit of effort to untie. Her hair was parted with a spear, a nod to ancient Roman martial values, and arranged into 6 braids. Topped with a flame-colored veil, flammeum, she looked less like a young woman and more like a sacrificial goddess. The ceremony itself could be religious, confariatio, with sacred bread, 10 witnesses and a priest, or purely civil, depending on the social status and preferences of the families involved. Either way, the symbolism was rich and the logistics clear. This was not just about 2 people, it was about 2 houses, and everyone knew it. After the formalities, the bride was taken from her parents in a mock abduction, a theatrical nod to the legendary rape of the Sabine women. Carried over the threshold of her new home, she was welcomed with fire and water, symbols of domestic life. Then came the wedding feast, which could be either modest or outrageously decadent, depending on how many senators you needed to impress. Gifts were exchanged, toasts were made, and the couple, who may have barely spoken before this, was expected to begin their new life with Roman efficiency. No honeymoon, no getting to know each other, just duty, family expectations, and a pile of dowry paperwork. And once the garlands faded and the guests stumbled home, the real marriage began. Quietly, within the walls of the domus, where appearances gave way to routine. Once the wedding feast ended and the togas were packed away, Roman marriage settled into something far less theatrical, domestic life. But don't mistake quiet for boring. Roman households were miniature empires, and marriage was a daily negotiation between power, duty, and survival. For elite couples, the household, or domus, was a hub of political and social activity. The husband often worked in law, the military, or politics. The wife? She ran the house. And that didn't just mean fluffing cushions. A Roman matron supervised slaves, managed finances, oversaw child rearing, planned religious ceremonies, and even handled social strategy. In some cases, she was the silent engine behind her husband's career. If she was in a sin manu marriage, she technically still belonged to her father's family, but in practice, she wielded real influence. Some women, like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, or Livia, wife of Augustus, were legendary for their wisdom and political savvy. These weren't just housewives, they were tacticians in tunics. However, expectations were strict. A Roman wife was supposed to be chaste, modest, obedient, and never too flashy. The ideal matron was praised for spinning wool and keeping quiet. Adultery, if discovered, could ruin her, and under Augustus's Lex Julia, it could even result in exile. The husband, on the other hand, he could discreetly enjoy a mistress, as long as she wasn't another man's wife. Roman double standards came gilded. Still, many marriages were affectionate, even tender. We have love letters, tomb inscriptions, and poetry that suggest real emotional bonds. Husbands praised wives as companions, muses, and equals. One inscription simply reads, "She lived with me for 40 years without a single quarrel," which is either deeply romantic or completely fabricated. Children were a shared goal, and fertility was almost sacred. A wife who bore many children gained social standing, one who didn't face suspicion, pressure, and often blame. Miscarriages, infant mortality, and the danger of childbirth made family life emotionally fragile. In the end, Roman marriage was about more than romance or routine. It was a social machine, an alliance that shaped politics, economy, and legacy. But when that machine broke down, Romans had a surprisingly simple solution. In ancient Rome, marriage might have been a public alliance, but divorce? That was often handled with the same effort as cancelling a subscription. No courtroom drama, no priestly intervention, just a statement of intent, and sometimes not even that. Divorce in Rome wasn't scandalous, it was normal, especially among the elite, where marriages were forged for strategy, not soulmates. If the alliance no longer served political, financial, or social goals, it could be dissolved as quickly as it had been arranged. For most of the Republic and well into the Empire, divorce required no written contract, no official approval, and no specific reason. A simple declaration, "Tuas res tibi habeto," take your things and go, could end the union. That was it. No-fault divorce 2,000 years before modern family law. Either spouse could initiate it, though in practice men had more freedom to act unilaterally. Women, especially those in sine manu marriages, did sometimes file for divorce themselves. All they had to do was leave the house and take their dowry back, assuming the husband didn't contest it. Reasons for divorce varied. Infidelity, infertility, political fallout, or just general annoyance could suffice. If your wife embarrassed you at a dinner party, grounds for dismissal. If your husband lost political clout, time to upgrade. Marriage was flexible because reputation was everything, and so was freedom to maneuver. Divorce wasn't even seen as immoral. In fact, some men divorced multiple times to climb the political ladder, marrying daughters of increasingly powerful allies. Even emperors joined in. Augustus exiled his own daughter Julia for alleged adultery and forced his stepson Tiberius into a miserable political marriage, which he later abandoned. But it wasn't always cold-hearted. Some divorces were mutual, and some were followed by remarriage between the same couple. Yes, Romans were recycling spouses long before it was trendy. The real battleground was the dowry. Returning it was customary, but not guaranteed. If a woman was found guilty of adultery, the husband could keep it. If he was at fault, her family might demand compensation. And if things turned nasty, lawsuits could drag out over cups, slaves, or goats. Ultimately, Roman divorce was efficient, transactional, and surprisingly modern. It lacked the guilt, but not the gossip. And if you thought divorce ended the drama, think again. The kids were next. In the Roman world, the main purpose of marriage wasn't love. It was legitimate children. Children weren't just personal joy. They were the glue that held a family's name, property, and future political power together. So when a marriage ended, the question was never who gets the kids, but whose legacy do they serve? Under Roman law, custody almost always went to the father. Children were legally part of the father's family under his patria potestas, his paternal power, which was nearly absolute. Whether the mother initiated the divorce or not, the children remained with their father unless he died or was declared legally incompetent. This meant that women, even those of high status, could be cut off from their children the moment they left the marriage. It was not uncommon for a woman to remarry and start a new household while her children remained behind in their father's care, raised by a stepmother or a team of slaves and tutors. It sounds cruel by modern standards, but Romans prioritized bloodline continuity over sentiment. Fathers decided education, marriage arrangements, and even punishments, sometimes severe ones. Legally, a father could even execute his child if he believed it was justified, though this was extremely rare and frowned upon in practice. Still, the symbolic authority was enormous, and yet Roman parents, particularly mothers, could be deeply affectionate. Gravestones and inscriptions are full of tender words. She was the light of our house. He lived only 5 years but brought joy to all. Despite the system, human emotion was never absent. Elite families groomed their sons for public life from birth. Boys were trained in rhetoric, history, and martial virtues. Daughters, meanwhile, were prepared for the social choreography of aristocratic marriage, learning modesty, obedience, and the art of managing a household that might house 50 slaves and multiple generations. Illegitimate children had few rights unless officially recognized. Adoption, on the other hand, was a powerful tool. A childless man could adopt a nephew or someone else's son entirely to ensure his name didn't die with him. Emperors like Augustus and Hadrian used adoption strategically to create heirs when biology didn't cooperate. In Rome, children weren't just a joy, they were infrastructure, and every marriage, every divorce, every dynasty was built on their shoulders. Despite the legal imbalance, Roman women, especially from elite families, were far from powerless in matters of marriage and divorce. With clever maneuvering, wealth, and sharp political instincts, many Roman women learned to use the system rather than be crushed by it. Take Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus. She divorced her first husband while pregnant, yes, really, to marry Octavian, soon to become emperor. She went on to become one of the most politically influential women in Roman history, advising her husband, manipulating succession, and maintaining her own estates. She didn't just survive the Roman marriage game, she mastered it. Or consider Fulvia, who married not one, not two, but 3 prominent Roman men, each more politically ambitious than the last. Her final husband, Mark Antony, left her behind in Rome while he chased Cleopatra, but Fulvia had already made her mark by raising legions and defending Antony's interests in his absence. She may have been married, but she was never secondary. Women from aristocratic families were often well-educated, managing vast estates and handling finances with the precision of a banker. Some women were so wealthy and influential that their dowries were used to bail out their husbands' careers or withheld in divorce as a bargaining chip. A shrewd woman could keep her wealth separate and her options open. The sine manu marriage model was key. Because these women stayed legally attached to their father's household rather than transferring into their husband's authority, they retained a rare level of financial autonomy. This allowed them to initiate divorce, manage their own wealth, and remarry, or not, on their own terms. Widows also gained freedom. Once a husband died, a woman became a legal adult, sui juris, no longer under male authority. Many widows inherited wealth and chose not to remarry, wielding quiet but considerable social influence. Of course, not every Roman woman was a Livia or a Fulvia. Many lived quietly, bound to household life. But among the upper echelons, there was a long line of women who manipulated the marriage system as effectively as any senator manipulated the Senate. In a society that claimed women belonged at the loom, some wove entire political legacies instead. For a society so practical about marriage and so casual about divorce, ancient Rome had surprisingly strict expectations when it came to adultery, especially for women. Affairs weren't just private matters, they were political, legal, and sometimes fatal. The double standard was glaring. A Roman husband could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines without legal consequence, as long as they weren't another man's wife. A wife, on the other hand, was expected to remain chaste, modest, and loyal, or risk public disgrace and legal punishment. The legal turning point came with Augustus's morality laws, especially the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis, law on the punishment of adultery. These laws made adultery a public crime, not just a private shame. Husbands were obligated to report their adulterous wives, and failing to do so could damage their reputation, or worse, lead to prosecution for pimping, lenocinium. A convicted woman could lose her dowry, be banished to a remote island, and even stripped of citizenship rights. Her lover faced similar penalties. Trials were public, humiliating affairs. Families were dragged into scandal, and reputations shattered like cheap pottery. But these laws weren't always about protecting morality. They were political tools. Augustus himself exiled his own daughter, Julia the Elder, for adultery, though historians suspect the real reason had more to do with her political entanglements than her bedroom habits. The same fate later befell his granddaughter. Morality, it seems, made an excellent excuse for cleaning up succession problems. Men weren't immune to scandal, though they faced less formal punishment. Public figures who took affairs too far, like Mark Antony's very public relationship with Cleopatra, were mocked, vilified, and sometimes driven from power. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial made careers out of roasting the sexually shameless, both male and female. Still, many affairs went unpunished. Privacy was rare, gossip was currency, and political enemies watched every move. For women, one wrong step could mean exile. For men, it usually just meant a few eye rolls and a new poem written about their vigorous appetites. Adultery in Rome wasn't just about broken vows. It was about honor, property, and control. It could ruin a marriage, tarnish a lineage, or bring down an entire political dynasty. And once the damage was done, there was only one solution left. Move on. Legally, publicly, and with your dowry. Hopefully, intact. 2,000 years later, the echoes of Roman marriage still linger. Not in our romantic comedies, perhaps, but in our laws, contracts, and social norms. Rome may have crumbled, but its marital framework quietly survived, hidden in the architecture of Western society. Roman marriage was never about love, not primarily. It was about status, succession, and social order. And yet, many of the mechanics feel oddly modern. Prenuptial agreements? The Romans had dowry contracts. Divorce by declaration? The Romans pioneered no-fault separation. Custody battles, inheritance disputes, property rights? Rome wrote the first drafts. Their flexibility was key. While many ancient societies treated marriage as sacred and indissoluble, Rome treated it like a civic arrangement. Serious, yes, but not eternal. This pragmatism allowed Roman women, particularly those from elite families, to move through multiple marriages, amass wealth, and even influence politics. In a culture that barred them from holding office, marriage became their backdoor to power. The legal distinctions they developed, sine manu, cum manu, dowry clauses, patria potestas, formed the basis of civil law in much of Europe and influenced modern systems from France to Latin America. Even the term matrimony survives from Latin matrimonium, which literally means the state of being a mother. That tells you everything about Roman priorities. But perhaps the most human legacy is this. Romans never stopped debating what marriage was for. Was it to produce heirs? To secure alliances? To find companionship? Even ancient writers argued about it. Some praised modest wives and simple homes. Others complained about bossy women, nagging husbands, and the rising divorce rates of their own time. By the late Empire, satire writers were lamenting that marriages were shorter than hairstyles, and some aristocrats had been married 6 or 7 times, each more politically convenient than the last. Despite all the rules, rituals, and expectations, Roman marriage was ultimately shaped by people, flawed, ambitious, passionate people, doing their best to balance personal desire with public pressure. They didn't always succeed, but they left behind a system that was astonishingly resilient. So the next time you see a wedding ring, a divorce settlement, or a political power couple smiling through gritted teeth, remember, the Romans were doing it first, with fewer vowels and more marble.